Alex Kirby reports on how the gay community is rethinking its attitude to AIDS. This report contains some specific medical details.
There is now a danger that has become a threat to us all. It is a deadly disease and there is no known cure. The virus can be passed during sexual intercourse with an infected person. Anyone can get it, man or woman. So far,
it's 11 years since the word AIDS first entered the language. 11 years in which about 19,000 people in Britain have been diagnosed as HIV positive, carriers of the human immunodeficiency virus. Just over 7,000 have succumbed to AIDS-related illnesses, and more than half of them have died. During the late 80s and early 90s, the government's health education campaigns emphasised that no one was invulnerable to the virus. The safe sex message applied to us all. But now that emphasis has changed. Last month, the Department of Health announced that it would be retargeting resources at the most vulnerable groups, drug addicts and gay men. The change in approach has once again put the spotlight on the gay community and the lifestyles of its members. After more than a decade of AIDS, illnesses and deaths, is the safe sex message getting through to a new generation of young male homosexuals? And if it's not, what has gone wrong?
In 1987, I developed a muscular wastage disease in my shoulders, which went throughout my entire body and caused me to go from 15 stone down to 7.5 stone within 3 months.
John Campbell is a gay man in his late 20s. He was diagnosed HIV positive 5 years ago and is now suffering a series of AIDS-related illnesses. He's a member of ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, a radical direct action group, and he says he'd be prepared to break the law in support of his cause, obtaining more funds to combat the epidemic.
I developed a pneumocystis, which is pneumonia, in the March of 1988 on my birthday. It was my birthday present to myself, I suppose. The problem I have at the moment is that there's an HIV-related bacteria in my mouth which is causing my teeth to break. It's causing the enamel of the teeth to weaken and break. And I haven't been able to get a dentist to treat me because of my HIV status, and I've had to wait. It'll be 10 days tomorrow to actually get in to see a specialist who will deal with HIV. The stigma that is involved in HIV is every single stigma you can think of. There's the issue of racism involved, the issue of sexuality, the issue of death. They're all there. They're all British stigmas. They're all things that Britain gets uptight about, and the British suddenly go, oh, shut up, don't speak about it, can't handle it.
In recent years, the vulnerability of gay men like John Campbell to the HIV virus has not been top of the policy agenda. It's been the continuing controversy about the threat to heterosexuals which has dominated headlines and public debate. Globally, 3/4 of those infected with HIV are heterosexuals. But in Europe and North America, the number of people who have caught the HIV virus through heterosexual sex alone, without the additional high-risk factors of drug addiction, bisexuality, or contact with infected partners from other parts of the world, remains small, though it's rising. The imminent publication of the Day report, a study of HIV infection, is likely to show that while the number of newly infected heterosexuals is lower than was predicted 2 years ago, there are still increases in the rates of infection among heterosexuals and homosexuals. Dr. Barry Evans is on the Day Committee and is a consultant epidemiologist at the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre. Does his research confirm the upward trend of infection among homosexuals?
We've been looking at some data from 1990 onwards, and the situation in the 90s seems to be worse than it was in the late 80s. We saw large behaviour change in the mid-80s that seemed to be sustained up until the late 1980s, and then 1990, 91, 92 seems to have seen a worsening of the situation. And markers that we use as markers of unsafe sex, such as rectal gonorrhea in gay men, and hepatitis B infection, and known what we call seroconversions, that's going from being HIV negative to HIV positive, have increased in the 1990s compared with what we knew of that in the late 80s. And that's obviously a real cause for concern, because that will continue to produce people who are diseased and have AIDS late on into the decade because of this long period of asymptomatic infection.
Is it possible at this stage to say anything about the heterosexual community and infection rates there?
We're looking at a much longer time scale with the heterosexual transmission within the UK, and I think with a lot more uncertainty as to how quickly it will rise. But there's no doubt that it is rising. There are increasing numbers of heterosexually acquired infections, and a significant proportion of the newly diagnosed HIV infections now are occurring in heterosexuals. So there isn't much ground for optimism, I'm afraid.
So we are all at risk, even if we're not equally at risk. But when AIDS first arrived in Britain, the idea that heterosexuals could catch the virus at all was frequently denied. There were terrifying and inaccurate predictions of the number of people who would be claimed by the AIDS epidemic during the 80s. It was in this fevered atmosphere that much of the press, and not just the tabloids, styled AIDS the gay plague. There was talk of quarantine, of compulsory identification for people infected with HIV. The gay community saw itself being stigmatized as never before, and it responded. It worked hard to de-gay the issue, to emphasize as strongly as possible that this was not just a gay disease. Edward King has researched gay health campaigns and remembers that strategy with some misgivings.
In the late 80s, the emphasis was on everybody being equally at risk. There was a concerted attempt to avoid a focus on high-risk groups, to avoid too much emphasis on AIDS as it affected gay men, and instead to look at the heterosexual epidemic and to stress that AIDS doesn't discriminate, that AIDS is an equal opportunities virus, those sorts of slogans. It was argued that rather than describing groups in society as being at high risk, we should look at behaviours, at-risk behaviours, that rather than singling out, say, gay and bisexual men, drug users and so on as being at particularly high risk from HIV, we should look at sexual acts, and that everyone could practice those acts. The problem with that was that, of course, not everybody practicing a certain sexual act is equally at risk, that gay men are far more at risk if they're having unsafe sex than heterosexuals are at risk if they're having unsafe sex, simply because there's a lot more HIV around in the gay community. But again, what that should have told us is that there therefore needed to be an emphasis on safer sex campaigns for gay men, that in a field with limited resources, and obviously some sort of rationalisation was going to be needed, that due priority should be given to sustaining and improving even the safer sex campaigns for those who are most at risk. And instead, all the emphasis went on mass media advertising targeting the general population, and little or nothing for specific ongoing campaigns for gay men. We can now see that some of the strategies that were entered into in good faith in the 80s have turned out to have worked against gay men's best interests.
In the early days of degaying AIDS, there was so little medical and epidemiological evidence to go on that officials from the Department of Health consulted those who had some direct contact with the new disease. They talked to doctors from genitourinary clinics and representatives of the gay community itself. Tony Whitehead was a founder member of the Terence Higgins Trust. He has no qualms about the way he helped to de-gay the issue.
I personally bear some responsibility for the de-gaying of AIDS, but I think it has to be understood in the context of what was happening over the last 10 years. The pressure was on to finger the gay community, and this was not based on any medical information at all. The pressure was on from the very earliest days to say, look, this is a problem of and caused by the gay community. That was where the pressure was coming from. Where the medical information that was available suggested that was not the case, and indeed that medical information still suggests that is not the case. Clearly, there was value, there was a necessity, both in terms of trying to prevent the further stigmatization of the gay community, and indeed of shaking the wider community out of its complacency and saying, hang on, this is not a gay problem. The evidence suggests that we are all at risk, and that message I certainly proclaimed very loudly. I believed it to be the right message. I still believe it to be an important message. But I think in giving so much credibility to that, we did inadvertently help to lose the gay community the kind of support and money that should have been targeted there.
What followed the degaying of AIDS was the release of large amounts of money to fight the epidemic. If you include research, total spending by the Department of Health from 1986 to the present is £886 million. By far the larger part of that has gone on care and treatment for people with AIDS, and a far smaller part on education designed to keep people free of infection in the first place. Take 1992 and 3 as an illustration. The proportions are fairly typical. £181 million for the health authorities, who provide most of the care and treatment, £15 million for the local authorities, and £11 million for the Health Education Authority, who between them provide most of the official safe sex promotion. What gay activists now claim is that the gay community has lost disproportionately in the disbursement of the funds. Simon Watney is an art historian who spends a lot of his time trying to educate other gay men about health issues. He claims, for example, that the government has put more emphasis on the needs of intravenous drug users who are HIV positive than on those of gay men.
The reason why there isn't one message is because there isn't one epidemic. There never has been just one epidemic. There are epidemics of a virus which has different modes of transmission. Each one of those modes of transmission, if you like, has a quite distinct profile socially and requires distinct health education initiatives. Now, the government understood that in relation to injecting drug users. It set up injecting drug use centres for needle exchanges and so on in the drug dependency units and elsewhere. That worked very well. What intrigues and saddens me is that that pragmatic, realistic response to the issue of transmission amongst the injecting drug users was never matched by any parallel response to gay men. And the reason for that, I think, is clear. The government in the early stage of the epidemic thought that injecting drug users, male injecting drug users in particular, were the main, inverted commas, vector of infection into the so-called heterosexual community. They didn't give a damn about gay men because they didn't think gay men posed any particular problem to heterosexuals, as indeed we don't. The quality of our own lives, however, and our entitlement to life itself, frankly, has rarely, if ever, been considered in this country.
Are you saying government wrote you off, the gay community?
I think it did write us off. I don't think maliciously, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't think anybody sat down and said, we will stop health education going to gay men so that they will all die. But I think that was the inevitable consequence of government neglect.
We should have liked to put this point and several others to the Health Secretary, Virginia Bottomley, but she declined to talk to us. Her department did, however, send us a written statement outlining the general approach to AIDS, which is based on a mix of educational approaches at national and local level.
Mass media and community-based campaigns aimed at the general public have been strengthened by targeted work for specific sections of the population, including those whose behaviour or lifestyles may place them at particular risk, such as gay men who continue to make up the majority of HIV and AIDS cases and drug misusers. For the future, increased emphasis will be given to targeted work in view of the generally well-informed public we have in the UK. This will involve, as now, funding groups within the voluntary sector with special expertise in reaching those populations.
That's unlikely to satisfy those in the gay community who feel they haven't obtained their fair share of the AIDS money. In particular, they're concerned at the cutback in funding to voluntary organisations. When the government announced that it was refocusing its AIDS strategy, it also said it would be reducing its grants to the Terence Higgins Trust and the London Lighthouse, two of the leading charities in the AIDS field which offer particular information and support for gay men. Mrs. Bottomley explained the cuts by saying their original grants had been intended to prime the pump and not as a level to be maintained indefinitely. But why is the gay community putting so much emphasis on voluntary organisations when £15 million is going this year to local councils, largely to fund their health education work on AIDS? The answer, it seems, is that although the councils receive the lion's share of the AIDS money, very few of them appear to be addressing directly the needs of gay men, one of the high-risk groups. Evidence of this mismatch emerged in a recent survey by the North West Thames Regional Health Authority, collaborating with several gay groups. The survey examined how local authorities used their money to work with gay men. Edward King helped to write the report on what was found.
Last year we conducted a survey of health authorities, the people who are actually charged with putting most of the government HIV prevention money into practice, with devising the campaigns. And we found that 2/3 of them had never, ever, at any point during the epidemic, done any safer sex campaigns for gay men. When we looked more closely at the third who said that they had done some safer sex campaigns for gay men, we found that less than 5% of the overall sample had done anything that would meet even a generous definition of a substantial safer sex campaign for gay men. What that means in practice is that the vast majority of health authorities could disappear overnight, and you wouldn't see much difference in the level of safer sex campaigns for gay men.
Good afternoon, Violence Against Trust.
Good afternoon. Yes, you want to speak to someone in the library?
About?
From the information office.
One of the groups involved in carrying out the survey was the Terence Higgins Trust, whose chief executive is Nick Partridge. He found it hard to believe some of the excuses for inaction by councils.
We know from a survey that the Trust did with National AIDS Manual and North West Thames Regional Health Authority that very few organisations who are charged with health promotion work do work with gay men. And there are a range of reasons for that, which go from, we don't have those kinds of people here, try the next town, they have a theatre, through to there isn't the management's political strength behind this. We don't want to go into the rocky waters of being accused of promoting homosexuality, for instance, through to recognition that some statutory agencies feel they don't have the skills to do the work.
The irony of degaying the issue is that it has left the gay community feeling it has lost access to resources with no comparable gains to show. That irony is not lost on those who argue forcefully that the Liberal approach to AIDS sufferers has been wrong from the start. Terry Dix, the Conservative MP for Hayes and Harlington, is one of the earliest critics of the government's policy. He argues that if gay men have lost in the scramble for resources, they have no one to blame but themselves.
In the beginning, you see, the gay community they didn't want to be highlighted in this situation. They wanted the message to go out, they were all at risk. Now, at last, they're becoming to realise that this is a stupid message, and now they've moved their position. They said, well, I think we ought to be now targeting this money on the gay community. That wasn't their argument in the first place. The campaign that said, the iceberg campaign, that, quote, we're all at risk, heterosexuals and homosexuals alike. Not true. They suggested there would be 10,000 new AIDS cases every year over a 10-year period. In that period, there's only been 7,000. And of those 7,000, only 63 were cases that came between heterosexual contact. The rest were homosexual contact or drug addicts. And anybody with any common sense would have known this at the beginning. But in order to protect the gay community, we had this nonsensical mass PR scheme to say, quote, we are all at risk, whether you're homosexual or not. And that was a waste of money. I am opposed on this issue to the wasting of government money on a knee-jerk reaction based on no scientific evidence whatsoever. I'd be the same if it was being done on smoking or drinking or indeed leukemia in children. All I'm saying is I wish some of the money, if not all of the money, was spent on those people suffering for illnesses over which they have no control, over which they did not contribute, instead of wasting money on gays who, by their actions, their perversion as I call it, inflict themselves with this illness.
And within the gay community itself, there's discussion about whether the degaying strategy was in fact correct. It appears not to have won gay men a share of the available resources proportional to their susceptibility to the epidemic. But it may have done them worse damage than that. Edward King believes that degaying has cost the gay community dear.
If there'd been an honest acknowledgement that gay men were most at risk and that therefore needed special targeting of resources to make sure that the safer sex campaigns were effective. If gay men had said, look, we're in the middle of this epidemic, we're doing our best, we've achieved an awful lot already, and we need to sustain that, more respect could have been won, more stigmatisation avoided than the approach which suggested that AIDS was a gay problem that was now threatening others. It could be said that that approach meant that AIDS was perceived as a threat from gay men to heterosexuals and actually increased stigmatization, that gay men were seen as plague carriers who were coming with their disease and were now threatening the whole of society. It's perfectly arguable that that is likely to have increased stigmatization and prejudice against gay men rather than reducing it. Unless we're honest that HIV still disproportionately affects gay men, that gay men are most at risk, then we can't expect to see safer sex campaigns for gay men given the top priority which they need.
Out on the streets, a failure to hear the safe sex message is not academic, it's lethal. When you come to places like this, the gay red light stretch of Piccadilly in central London, you can't miss those who need to get the message. Youngsters with pinched faces who look as if they could do with a square meal and a roof over their heads, but who are in fact intent simply on turning the next trick and putting some money in their pockets. Dodging the traffic, sheltering in shop doorways from the showers, always on the lookout for punters, these boys are the vulnerable face of the gay scene. Some call in at the agency headed by Tony Whitehead, Streetwise Youth, where they can find something to eat, a helpful counsellor, and a supply of condoms.
Young men under 21 who are out there on the streets selling sex for survival come to us with a pre-existing high level of knowledge about HIV and the risk factors. Where there are major problems is in the negotiating skills necessary to put that into practice when, of course, basically they are starving, they're desperate for money, and a punter is offering money for sex, and the person's very needy, and that's where the skills are needed. That's where education, our input, is focused, is in developing those sort of social skills that they need to actually follow through to turn the knowledge into practice.
At the centre, we talked to several male prostitutes, none of them beyond their early 20s. They told us of their difficulties in coping with older clients who were offering the chance of shelter in exchange for sex, often without a condom.
Like the punter is saying, right, I'll pay you more if you don't use a condom. Don't it, you know? They say, right, I'll give you, £50 quid extra if you don't, use a condom, and you're thinking, but what do I think? Do I think about safe sex, or do I think about the money? But say, if it's totally drunk out your head, what do you think of? Do you think of the condom first or the money first?
A lot of my clients turn me down because I use safe sex. And I'm just getting sick of it because I'm losing out on money, and because I don't know, it's the older men, they're turning around and they're saying that there weren't none of these diseases around when they were our age, but they're not their age anymore. We're in the 90s now, and this disease is a killer, and if they don't listen, they're all going to die of it.
Prostitution of any description is one of the easiest routes for spreading the virus. For boys like these, it's hard enough even to have access to detailed information about the safe sex message, let alone to act on it.
Well, yeah, the message is for just about everybody, but they don't target gay people, and I think they should, because it's gay people who I think are a lot more promiscuous, and it's a lot easier to catch it from gay to gay sexual contact.
Tell me, from your clients, do you find that most of them know as much about the dangers as you do, or care as much?
Some do, but some don't, because they're usually much older people, and they've had sex all their lives, or just about all their lives, and unsafe sex without condoms, because there was never HIV 20, 30 years ago. Well, it wasn't in the forefront anyway.
If you were in charge of getting the message across to the gay community that HIV and AIDS are here and they're a deadly threat, what would you want to do? What sort of advertisements, and where would you put them?
I'm not really sure, but I know one thing is, as a gay man myself, sometimes I feel a great sense of low self-esteem, and it's getting through to that, because if you do feel low and down, then you're not going to really care anyway. So you've got to tell people that they are good and they are worth caring about, and they've got to look after themselves as much as everybody else, so use condoms.
Up north, there's virtually nothing. I came down to London, a complete stranger. I only knew one little spot, which is where I went when I came down a few years ago, and I knew nothing, virtually. There was very little advertising or knowledge of safer sex around, and there isn't nowadays for the younger people, especially prostitutes, male prostitutes in particular. Female, yeah, but not for male, or anything in the gay community. You have to be a reader of the gay papers to get anything of it.
Of course, many gay men do see the official safe sex message. To avoid it, they'd have to make sure they never opened a newspaper or switched on a television or radio. But they say that degaying the epidemic means that the message is now so bland and bowdlerized that, to them, it's almost meaningless. The most recent television advertisement, for example, shows an elderly man proudly displaying his condom, a model that looks as if it could have come out of the Ark.
I just don't know why young people complain about having to wear condoms against HIV virus and AIDS. Look what we had to put up with. I called it Geronimo, my friend. Compared with the condoms of today, it was like wearing the inner tube of a cycle.
This advertisement was the brainchild of the Health Education Authority, responsible at national level for informing us about HIV and AIDS. Simon Watney, the health educator, finds the advertisement typifies the authority's approach, which he says is far from helpful.
Almost everything that the HEA has done since the very beginning of its interventions seems to me to have been euphemistic or stilted or obscure to the point of banality. The old boy pulling out the First World War condom and whatever that was only reinforces the idea that condoms are some sort of big deal and a problem. The idea that in 1993 the HEA is spending millions to broadcast so-called HIV ads which actually undermine condom use seems to beggar the imagination.
The authority does have a health department grant of over £11 million this year, but that's for promoting not just safe sex, but safe everything. It can't say exactly how much goes on funding safe sex campaigns aimed directly at gay men. Lindsay Neal is the HEA's Director of AIDS and Sexual Health. She defends their approach.
You will find people who don't like that ad. But the vast majority of people who've seen it do like it. They do understand the message. You know, the intention is to try and make it a bit light-hearted to say, well, you know, condoms have been around for a very long time, and they're a lot better than they used to be. And our evaluation says quite clearly that amongst the general population and the targeted evaluation we do with gay men, they understand that message and they find the humour very acceptable, and they also find the message underneath that humour very understandable, very clear.
How do you find the gay men you use for testing your ads on?
We draw them from different parts of the country. We look at different ages, different classes. Where possible, we try to get an ethnic mix, and we do what we call focus groups, which is actually taking people through the ads, giving them a whole range of different treatments, and get their responses to that. It's quite a long process, actually.
Or you can. What about just leaving a hole where it's going to be on the page? Just run it out, and we'll just mark it up.
Official attempts to promote safe sex are not the only ones, of course. Here in the office of Boys magazine, it's copy day, and the finishing touches are being put to the next issue. The paper really grew out of the epidemic. Its founders have always seen it as something which will inform and educate young gay men in the process of entertaining them. Boys does, informally and from its own resources, the sort of job the gay activists say should be done by the official communicators. So it runs features on topics like how to get a boyfriend or how to look good in order to go out on the scene. And matter-of-factly, it tries to get over the facts about HIV and the facts about how to make sure that sex is safe. David Bridle, one of its founders, explains what that requires.
The simple, most important piece of information is that if gay men have penetrative sex, they must always use a condom. Whoever their partner is, however long they've been with that partner, they must always use a condom. And it's that essential message which first and foremost must come across, because it's that way that HIV can most easily be transmitted. We also try and say, concern yourself about other things like oral sex. We try and present what the current view is about the risks involved with other kinds of sex. But most importantly, we say there are lots of other ways of having sex which don't put you at risk at all from HIV. And that's to do with people using their imagination. It's to do with people using things like sex toys, things like dressing up, role-playing, things like that. And so Yes, we do advocate the idea that people should enjoy their sex life, but we'd say that they should do it in a safe way. Boys is about sex. We are sex positive, but we are sex positive in a responsible way, I hope.
What may be needed to promote safe sex, giving young men the knowledge that can save their lives, isn't always the same as what's possible. It's certainly not always the same as what the law allows. And David Bridle envies publishers in some other countries their ability to write and to show exactly what they mean in quite explicit terms.
Well, here we have a selection of leaflets from Holland, Germany, France, which show young gay men having sex. It shows young gay men having penetrative sex. It shows them putting on condoms. It shows them having oral sex. And it gives explicit detail about what you can and can't do. And we compare that with the work, for instance, of the Health Education Authority of a couple of years ago, where you have soft focus photograph of two young guys at dinner with the byline, if your sex life is unprotected, so too is your relationship. It's a good point to be made, but will young gay men take any notice of two pretty middle-class men having dinner in a restaurant? I really don't think so. And here we have an example, for instance, from Holland, of a booklet which was distributed to all schools, which is about helping young gay people come to terms with their sexuality, but also at the end includes extremely useful information about HIV and safer sex. What better way could you have to actually get the message across?
And could that booklet legally be published in Britain?
No, it could not. The laws in this country mean that you can't show an erect penis with a condom being put on it. It means that we have a ludicrous situation where in order to show how to put on a condom, we would need to use something like a banana. The government's moral values campaigns, which say that homosexuality should not be regarded as normal and that schools should teach that homosexuality is not normal, mean that we are not getting the message across to young gay people who can't help the fact that they're gay. It also means that, for instance, we can't publish material in this country of the kind of explicitness which is required in order to make it effective.
But is an explicit message really needed? Outside the main urban centres, anyway. Lindsay Neal of the Health Education Authority says they've found that you can reach many gay men with material that's much blander than the sort of thing boys' magazine prints, and that being explicit is often entirely unnecessary.
It's true that we don't use homoerotic images, but we check out what message it is that we're trying to give, that is necessary to give to the gay men, because they're telling us that this is what they need, and we design ads that are effective around that. And they are not using homoerotic images, but they're accurate, they're factual, and they're clear, and they're very well received by the gay men they're targeted at. We test these ads with gay men all around the country, and we've been doing this through the Gay Bar Study for something like 6 or 7 years, where we actually go out and talk to gay men about the sort of information that they feel they need. We design adverts with that in mind, test them with these men, and then evaluate the impact of those. And in complete contrast with what some of the gay men are telling you, our research tells us that on the latest ads, something like 91% of gay men agreed that people need advertisements like this to remind them about the risks of HIV. What these advertisements were saying came across clearly to me. Now, it's on the basis of this kind of research that we move our advertising forward.
Any debate about the gay community tends to assume that it is just that, a single monolithic community. In reality, of course, there are differences of age, class and ethnic background. The metropolitan activists who worked hard to de-gay AIDS, they inadvertently have lost touch with the more prosaic needs of many gay men in other parts of the country. When AIDS was first making itself felt 10 years ago, they managed to get a very simple message out to large numbers of people, that unprotected sex could be a killer. They were so successful that gay sexual behaviour underwent a rapid and radical change. And they managed it all with virtually no resources. The question is, if the gay community could spread the word then, why can't it do it now? Peter Scott of Gay Men Fighting AIDS says that, with a bit of extra help, it can.
Our crucial priority is to restart a kind of safer sex movement amongst ordinary gay men, so that in the ordinary, routine course of their everyday lives, they're, if you like, being enthused again and reminded that they can make a huge difference to and with and for other gay men. In everything they do, they can be, if you like, acting as lay, as informal peer educators. What we want to do is to restart that movement so that gay men are talking about safer sex with one another again, so that they're teaching each other about safer sex, so that they're thinking about it, so that they're aware that there's this terrible epidemic that's affecting us. But in the past, and to an extent in the present, we have known what to do about it, and we know what to do about it. If we trust ourselves, and if we remind ourselves that we're the ones who are going to do it, we're the ones who know about gay sex, who know about other gay men, we're the ones who care about other gay men, we're the ones who love each other, for heaven's sake. So we're the ones that are going to have really strong reasons to be doing this safer sex education. All we need is a little bit of resourcing, a little bit of help to get this going.
The wheel has come full circle. By degaying AIDS, for reasons that made sense at the time, gay men may have been made more vulnerable, not less. The Day report will spell out how infection is spreading. 1 gay man in 4 testing HIV positive in Brighton, 1 in 5 in some districts of London, 1 in 20 among 15 to 19-year-old gay men in certain parts of the country. In the gay clubs and bars of London, there's an acknowledgement by those in their teens and early 20s that unless the safe sex message is once again forced into their brains more effectively, they're quite likely to ignore it.
I think the message has to be reinforced for every generation or every group. It has to be a part of your education, wherever that might be. In that sense, I think that every age group and every generation from now onwards is always at risk from HIV if education and information isn't properly given across to them.
The idea, I suppose, is to constantly be making people aware of this kind of thing, and in order to do that, you must keep reviewing the kind of material you're bringing out in order to keep it fresh, in order to make sure that people keep listening and keep getting the message and keep practicing safer sex.
My concern is not for the people who get to gay bars or not for the people who get to see boys. It's for the ones who don't. It's for the people who don't know gay people. It's for people who are very young who are having gay sex with each other. I mean, there's this extraordinary idea in the government that you have to learn it from somebody else when you're much older. It's complete nonsense, you know. There must be in this country 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds experimenting with each other. It only takes one of them at the top of the chain to be having some unsafe sex with somebody who's a bit older than himself for it to filter back the way down. As you can see from the HIV figures, it's very much younger gay men who are at risk because they're not being taught the information.
The need for a renewed safe sex movement among gay men looks increasingly pressing. 11 years after the start of the epidemic, gay men are dying needlessly. What worked then will probably work now. A clear message, endlessly repeated, unambiguously presented. And if young men like Didi are to be saved from a premature death, it will certainly need persistence. At just 19, the safe sex message has already passed him by. Didi, tell me, what do you know about HIV and AIDS and the safe sex message?
Well, I'm positive anyway, so I don't really know. I mean, it's basically play safe, no matter who it is, where it is, and who they are.
Where did you get that message from?
Once I became positive, I thought of it myself. I mean, it's something that happens. The person I was going out with didn't tell me that he was positive, and then I ended up with it. You know, what can you do? You believe the person that you're in love with. You take their word for it.
If the message had got to you earlier, do you think you wouldn't have become positive?
Yeah, I reckon, yeah. If it had become out closer, yeah. I reckon I wouldn't have become positive. It's not getting through to people. I mean, people ain't listening to what's going on.
The
Reporter in this week's File on 4 was Alex Kirby, and the programme was produced in Manchester by Paul Seapen. The editor is Helen Bowden. Next week, Joyan Jenkins asks why the system for licensing drugs is shrouded in secrecy.